Revolutions Per Minute is a weekly radio show from the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. Recorded live at WBAI 99.5 in Brooklyn every Wednesday at 9 p.m. RPM's about doing the work to build a democratic socialist future. Each week, hear the latest news, analysis, and organizing experience from the minds and hearts of activists fighting every day in New York City. Join the movement at Socialist.NYC.
Hey, what's up, New York City? This is Amy Wilson. You're listening to Revolutions Per Minute live from WBAI. We are a socialist radio show and podcast from members of the New York City Democratic Socialists of America. The Democratic Socialists of America is the largest socialist organization in the United States with 80,000 members nationwide. NYC-DSA is its biggest chapter. We are run by our 7,000 plus members and organizers who are working together to build democratic socialism in all 5 boroughs. Once again, my name is Amy Wilson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a member of North Brooklyn DSA. It's the eve of Thanksgiving here in New York City. It's a challenging holiday for many, not only because of its reminder of settler colonialism and indigenous genocide, but also because it often involves spending time with family, where difficult conversations about hot topics like religion and politics can arise. On tonight's episode, I'm here live with members of NYC-DSA's Religion and Socialism Working Group to discuss the fascinating intersections between faith and spirituality and organizing for socialism. We hope you'll leave this show feeling prepared for whatever virtual dinner table conversation might arise tomorrow or throughout this holiday season. We also hear an update from our South Brooklyn branch and Sunset Park Popular Assembly on the inhumane conditions at Brooklyn's Metropolitan Detention Center, a federal prison in our backyard, and the organizing to demand justice for murdered inmate Jamel Floyd. And of course, we'll open the phones twice during the show to hear from our live WBAI audience. It's going to be a great show, but first, the headlines with Simone Norman.
Mayor Bill de Blasio announced that public schools would shut down in-person schooling from November 19th through Thanksgiving. Dozens of protesters gathered outside City Hall to demand that de Blasio reopen schools, which are relatively unlikely to spread COVID-19, especially compared to restaurants and bars, which remain open. The MTA is seeking a $3 billion loan from the Federal Reserve to cover its 2021 budget gap. Without the loan or a significant increase in state taxes, the agency is reportedly considering massive cuts to balance their 2021 budget, including a 40% reduction in subway service and laying off more than 9,000 transit workers. While the city continues to face a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit without a federal bailout or increased revenue from the state, Mayor de Blasio and Comptroller Scott Stringer identified $840 million in unexpected tax revenue, mildly improving budget prospects. The NYC Department of Transportation has added new safety requirements for outdoor dining as the city prepares to continue the program through the winter. The city is close to securing a 90-day emergency stockpile of personal protective equipment for healthcare workers, but the New York State Nurses Association and some city council members are concerned that this is too small. Over half of the $100 million allocated for New York's COVID rent relief program still has not been spent due to stringent requirements imposed by the state and will need to be returned to the Treasury Department if not spent by December 30th. The $500 million deep cleaning program that required the MTA to suspend overnight service in April is not worth it, according to experts who say it has no appreciable effects on COVID transmission. City Comptroller and mayoral candidate Scott Stringer is suing the de Blasio administration for documents and records pertaining to the city's response to the pandemic. And Governor Cuomo is getting an international Emmy for his televised COVID-19 briefings. In election news, despite early reports of a strong election night for Republicans in New York City, Max Rose was the only incumbent Democrat representing any part of the city to lose. As mail-in votes from this month's election continued to be counted, 2 more state Senate races were called for the Democrats, including Andrew Gennardes in South Brooklyn, giving them 41 seats with 4 races still uncalled. One more victory would give the Democrats a supermajority in the upper chamber, which would mean the legislature could override a gubernatorial veto. Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams and nonprofit executive Diane Morales both officially entered the 2021 mayoral race. Adams held an indoor fundraiser to celebrate, even as the city's COVID rates are rising above the 3% threshold. Local election officials are embarrassed by New York State's exceptionally slow pace in tallying absentee votes. And finally, The Independent breaks down the $35,000 in donations that council member Robert Cornegy of District 36 received from the real estate industry so far in his campaign for Brooklyn Borough President.
Thank you, Simone. Our headlines are brought to you by The Thorn, an incredible weekly newsletter by New York City DSA's Electoral Working Group, covering local politics and radical activism. You can subscribe at thethorn.nyc. So tonight I'm joined by 3 wonderful comrades from the Religion and Socialism Working Group of New York City DSA. And we'll start our show, as we always do, by hearing about each of these comrades. Please tell me and the audience about yourself, how you came to participate in the Democratic Socialists. What are the social forces that shaped you as a person and an organizer? And we'll go to our comrade Daniel first. Oh, you have to unmute yourself, comrade.
Hi, Amy. Thank you for having me. I'm glad and happy to be joined by Sarah and Grim as well. A little bit about myself. I graduated from NYU Wagner and then public policy. My interest in the organization really came after 2008. I was involved in the like most people got with the hope and change involved in the Obama campaign. And but unfortunately, a little bit after the election, I realized that nothing really was changing, and there was not much of hope. And so I started to recently get involved with DSA, where I believe I found my home. And I've been with DSA now for about a year and a half. And I'm a Muslim, and that's how I identify. And how do I? What inspired me to be more activist is just we all are familiar with Trump's ban on Muslims, and as a spiritual person, I've been really hurt by that personally. And also, if you look at the situation right now around the world, war on terrorism. There was a report done by Intercept killed millions of Muslims around the world, and not only that, then you see what's happening in France right now, in Europe. I mean, it's like a wave of Islamophobia. So what I hope to do with my colleagues and my comrades is to raise that awareness, and that's what brought me to be more active, to raise my voice.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for your work and for joining us here on Revolutions Per Minute. And next, let's hear from Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. Thank you for putting this together, Amy. It is notable that I think all 3 of us here, between Gary and Danielle, are people of color. And I think if DS is serious about engaging sort of the working class and people of color, I think religion will have to be something that you'll have to become at least very literate in. And you can't simply dismiss as the opium of the masses, so to speak. All pronouns are okay with me. I grew up in a Pentecostal evangelical church in Malaysia, moved to New York, California, and then New York when I was quite young. I'm now the executive director of my church in Brooklyn, forefront New York City. And I work a fair amount as a freelance journalist and writer. A bit similar to Danielle, but later on got involved through a political campaign, Bernie's in 2016. His message kind of spoke to me just in terms of like financial stresses growing up as with immigrant parents. Money was the main thing my parents always fought about. And also, I think I joined the campaign shortly after a 1 month travel through Southeast Asia, where I was really interested in the link between anti-imperialism and communism. I have a great grand aunt in my family, kind of lore, who was a communist and who was killed. So I just kind of became curious about that, and that kind of led to a certain kind of radicalization. So part of the Religion Socialism Working Group, I used to host one of their podcasts, and I'd recommend listening to it.
Yes. And finally, just for introductions, let's go to Giram. How are you this evening?
Doing well, Amy. Hi, everyone. My name is Giram Jung. My pronouns are he and him. I'm visiting assistant professor at Iliff School of Theology out in Denver. Because of the pandemic, we're doing stuff remotely, so I'm still living out here. And this is my first semester working there. I got involved with the DSA while I was in graduate school in LA. A friend of mine was the co-organizer of the Pomona Valley chapter of LA-DSA. And I got more actively involved with DSA after I moved back to the East Coast after schooling. I got plugged in with the New York City Afro-Socialist Caucus and the Religion and Socialism Working Group when I came back. So I grew up in a working class, single parent Korean American household. I was born a year after the 1988 Olympics hosted in South Korea, and Korea was a turbulent time when I was born. There was student protests and demonstrations for the democratization movement that was going on at the time. And even though I don't remember it, apparently the police were shooting tear gas on the streets so much that the tear gas went into our ground level apartment all the time while my mother was pregnant, as well as after I was born. So you can imagine that I already had a kind of a political exposure to police and state violence since I was a young age. Korea also, has been marred by division since the end of World War II, and influenced by two imperial countries, right? Imperialist countries and the geopolitics of that. And so I was always critical of Euro-American political messianism. But to go back, I studied Marxism in undergrad from one of my adjunct professors who was great. I studied liberation philosophy and theology during my master's, and I specialized in studying Black radical traditions as well as East Asian religions in relationship to the question of decoloniality. So that's enough about me.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you all with us tonight, and I think this is a great conversation to be having here as we sort of step into a very odd winter holidays season, and we're reckoning with some very big questions as a socialist movement and as a wider culture. So let's start with a big picture question. Religion plus socialism. Are there any misconceptions or things that you'd like to set the record straight that you encounter around being somebody who is both religious or spiritual and socialist? And as an extension from that question, in your experience and in your studies, how do you find that different religious traditions inform socialist practice? And we can go to Sarah first.
Oh, okay, me. I think I'm a bit used to the walking contradiction as a sort of queer Christian as well. So I'm used to kind of explaining myself in either space. Typically, when I try to talk to people about how they come together, I tend to have to explain a bit more to Christians, I think, than to socialists. At least within DSA, I haven't really encountered any, mean people, basically. But I think Christianity in particular I would like to describe it as an incarnational religion, with sort of the belief that God took on human flesh and walked on this earth. And so I think inherent in that message is a sense that things on this earth matter, our human bodies matter, things that happen to our bodies matter. And particularly as someone who is sort of a clergy member, the way I like to explain it is, if a congregant comes to me and it says, "Can you pray for me about my work? It's really stressful right now." I will pray for them, and hopefully it will be helpful. But then I'll also say, "Hey, have you talked to your coworkers and whether they have similar stresses? And maybe you should come together, short of like handing them a manual, like how to form a union. I think part of what it means for me to care for my congregants is to care for their material needs, in addition to their psychological, obviously, and spiritual needs. So I try to think about that, but sort of more broadly, I recommend, if people are interested, to read any of the early church fathers on their positions on poverty. Just quote one. St. John Chrysostom talks about how not to share our wealth with the poor is to rob them and take away their livelihood. The riches we possess are not our own, but theirs as well. And so it's a really key interdependent sense of property. And you see that in the Catholic encyclicals as well. Fratelli Tutti just came out. Similar, message around how the right to private property is secondary to universal goods. We also see it in the Bible with Acts chapter 2, where, in the early church, it says all believers had everything in common, and people sold their possessions so that no one would be in need. And so referencing that and like kind of liberation theologians from Latin America that talk about the preferential option for the poor within Catholicism. You also have just a history of Christian socialism in Europe and in America that predates even the DSA. These are all good things to Google if you're interested, and particularly if you're looking for more content. There's a kind of cottage industry now of Christian socialist podcasts. You have Faith and Capital, you have Magnificast, you have a magazine called Bias Magazine, and obviously DSA has her own podcast. Religion, Socialism Worker has her own podcast, and a webinar that includes multiple faiths, but Christianity does play a big role in it.
Danielle or Guillaume, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there might be a few misconceptions about Islam out there. I am suspicious that it might be. Sometimes you find yourself, at least as a Muslim, trying to, apologizing for any small amount, whatever incident that occurs, that it must be the 1.7, 1.8 billion of you. And so each one of you. And I feel like that becomes like a burden. But also, as a Muslim, when you look at the foundation, what brings the idea of socialism, I mean, this predates socialism, but Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he was the activist, himself. Like when you look at, like when I studied his times, how he stood against injustices that he saw, how he thought about, taking care of the neighbors, taking care of the weak, taking care of the women and the women's rights in that age where it was unheard of. So that idea is what inspired me to bring, and what at the same time in today's age, what hurts is all of the misconceptions that exist. So there's a fine there's an environment that's I think for Muslims at least is difficult to navigate in today's age. But if I think as a Muslim, it's being a socialist is a natural part. A lot of hadiths, which are like the sayings of the Prophet, a lot of the texture. Now, I'm not a religious scholar. This is just a disclaimer. But a lot of it in the text, in the Quran, in the holy books, there's a reference to, if you hurt one human being, it's as if you hurt all of mankind. So there's like this universal morality that goes beyond just oneself. And I think that is the idea where socialism comes from, the idea of one should not just be self-absorbed, but rather think of oneself as part of a society, and what impacts me impacts others, and we should be more mindful in that end.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting, just even as we're starting off, to hear about the different angles that different faith traditions approach the central questions about things like equality and inequality, wealth and poverty. What is our moral duty to each other? I think it's fair to say that those are eternal questions, and what differs is the approach and the conclusions that are drawn about what is appropriate to do. This is Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM, streaming on your favorite podcast app. You can connect with us after the show by emailing revolutionsnyc@gmail.com. You can find us on our website, revolutionsperminute.simplecast.com, or on Twitter at NYC-RPM. I'm Amy Wilson. I'm here with members of our Religion and Socialism Working Group, and that is exactly what we are talking about, the intersection between religion and politics. So, Guram, I'd love to give you a chance to weigh in.
Sure, thank you. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up is that the earliest instance of revolution or rebellious activity against racialized capitalism of modernity, which Christina Sharp highlights as being inaugurated through the capture and transportation of human cargo in the transatlantic slave trade, was by former slaves in the Black Atlantic, as well as slaves that incited insurrection and rebellion against the Euro-American gentry class that were profiting off of the pilfering of resources in the Western Hemisphere. And so to talk about revolution against racial capitalism and not mentioning this, I think would be a big disservice. I would say that religion and spirituality had a great deal to do with those that were actively rebelling against their slave masters in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in the Caribbean. If you look at Haiti, which was the first country, and perhaps, as CLR James said, the only country in which there was a successful slave revolution, right? And of course, we know that Haiti at the time was under the control of France, and the infamous Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte was the ruler of France at the time. Haiti had a leader. His name was Toussaint Louverture, and my French is really bad, so apologize for that. And he was a slave who inspired his people to rise up and successfully led a military campaign against the French government, the colonial government. And he was a devout Catholic. Even after the end of the Haitian Revolution, he tried to promote Catholicism as a religious practice that would provide some sort of moral or spiritual assistance, right, for the newly independent Caribbean nation state. Slave rebellions in the Caribbean as well as Latin America also relied heavily on Afro-diasporic religions such as Vodou, Santeria, Candomblé, Orisha Vodou, and so on and so forth. The 1791 Haitian Revolution, it's famously said that there was a Vodou ceremony that was initiated prior to the slaves beginning the uprising and revolution. And we also have historical evidence of Maroon culture in Saint-Domingue, as well as in the Quilombo dos Palmares communities in Brazil, right? Preserving African beliefs and practices, as well as the practice of rebellion, right? And the safe harbors where escaped slaves can go and organize against the slaveholder class. Moving to Asia, which is the area of my other area of specialization, there was Buddhist socialisms that were being formed at the turn of the 19th and 20th century in Korea and Japan and India as well, where Buddhist leaders such as Senojiro in Japan were reforming Nichiren after his encounter with socialist texts. Manhe, who predates Senojiro in Korea, forming Minjung Buddhism as an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, socially engaged form of Buddhism that would equip the masses with Buddhist practice, spiritual practice, and a socioeconomic analysis learned from socialism. B.R. Ambedkar in India, who was seen as the father of the modern Indian constitution, he introduced Navayana Buddhism in India and converted millions of the Dalit members of the Dalit community, the untouchable community, into Buddhism. But he also did a strong analysis of Buddhism as compatible because it was liberatory and had many overlaps with Marxist thought as well. So that's just a little bit of what I wanted to share.
Thank you. Yeah, really interesting overview. And I think because we're still living in a very Eurocentric culture, I think people tend to think of religion as being Protestant or maybe even Abrahamic religions, but they don't tend to widen their perspective to all the incredible diversity of spiritual expression that there is in the world and how that intersects with politics. So I'd love to go ahead and open the phones just for a minute. We're about halfway through our show. So WBAI World, if you'd like to call in with a comment or question about religion and socialism, please give us a call. The number here is 212-209-2877. Once again, that's 212-209-2877. And while we wait for anybody to give us a call here in our little mid-show break, I'm wondering if any of the three of you would like to speak on where you see the application of religion in socialist organizing today, perhaps a modern example of a religious or spiritually influenced socialist practice. I see you all thinking. And I take it that we don't have any callers on the line. Number one more time is 212-209-2877 here on Revolutions Per Minute, the radio show of the Democratic Socialists of America in New York City. You can give us a call if you have something to say about religion and socialism.
I feel if I was more Catholic, I would have more examples. They're just like on the tip of my head. The most concrete thing I can think of right now is I have a couple friends, I think they were written up in BuzzFeed, who run a church called Jubilee Baptist Church. And the church, I think, is not necessarily great at talking about or addressing large systemic stuff, but they're very good at church is very good at interpersonal kind of, it's a bit more anarchist, I think, than social in some ways, like that sort of ethic. And so they have a practice of debt relief, basically, where you kind of send in an application and basically you're approved and they'll purchase your debt off you and cancel your debt and then sort of pay it forward for the next person and what have you. They also in that church have something called financial literacy course. My friend Kevin is one of the pastors there, and basically they just read Marx together, and they have a sort of a workplace anonymous group, a la kind of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so, it's not necessarily explicitly socialist per se, but along the lines of political education and kind of radical praxis within a community. It's sort of one of my models so far as how church can be.
Thank you. And looks like we've got a caller on the line. Hi, caller. You're on with Revolutions Per Minute. What is your comment or question?
Great show. I like the topic and everything. And it's funny. It's not even funny. It's so poignant, or whatever you want to call it, where even in the Haiti Revolution, I don't know if I got the whole thing straight, but I do know that the slaves could only rebel. They only did successfully rebel in Haiti, from what we understand. And quite united in soul and spirit. That's the only thing that got them out of that. And to have him turn that over, I didn't know that he had turned that over to Catholicism, to give them belief in some kind of moral value system. Because it's socialism. I just wanted to say one thing here. It's kind of, I had an experience, whatever, nervous breakdown, looking at the world. And I had, as everybody comes to God and Jesus crying and all this nervous breakdown thing, but all this stuff is coming true. But it's just amazing that we mock Jesus. Everybody mocks Christianity because we can't follow it properly. But they never go out and really attack what he said. They attack, what Leviticus said and what this and that said. But with all the people in jail that he spoke of, and all the, the health care he spoke of, and all of the injustices in the courtroom and that he represented, and the injustice of the whole system that we are still living under is so poignant that nobody's come out and said it. My book, I wrote this thing down. I just happened to write it down as a spiritual moment, and it came out of me like, but whatever, it's all coming true. It reads like Revelations 10.9, which means the countdown to either we make it or we don't. And the great thing is that America is the melting pot. If we don't make it here and we don't get it straight here, the world will never make it, because we have everybody. If we don't get along here, the world's done. So the great experiment of mankind will probably be over. I mean, I don't know if that's true, but that's what it seems like.
Thank you so much for calling in. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we've got a show to get through. And thank you for listening and for calling in. And it's interesting that you do bring up the apocalypse, because that's actually one of that's actually how we all met tonight. My comrades who I'm broadcasting on the show with, the Religion and Socialism Working Group did an event about different conceptions of apocalypse and how that relates to eco-socialism and the pressing need that we have to organize for climate justice and against climate capitalism and disaster capitalism. So again, thank you so much for calling in. This is Revolutions Per Minute on the one and only listener-sponsored independent station in New York City, WBAI. It's rare to find in-depth conversations about topics like this that include diverse perspectives. So if you enjoy Revolutions Per Minute, please support the station that makes our work possible by giving a little bit of money every month to become a BAI buddy. It also allows you to participate in the democracy of the station by voting in station-wide elections, or perhaps even running for the local station board as a listener representative. So please, if you can, call 516-620-3602 or go to wbai.org. And to all of our donors and buddies out there, we see you, we love you, and thanks so much for your support. So we're here tonight talking about religion and politics, and our caller actually brought up an interesting point, which is people in jails and the failure of our society to cope with the carceral system. Also, our comrade Giram brought up slave revolts. Many people believe that our modern-day carceral system is a modern-day version of slavery. And in the United States and elsewhere, faith communities have long been at the front lines for social justice, including in the abolitionist movement. Perhaps you think the 19th century when you hear that word, but it's also happening here right now in the 21st century as we fight to end the carceral state. So one such struggle is actually happening right here in New York City. Advocates are demanding that residents of the notorious Metropolitan Detention Center, a federal prison in Sunset Park, be freed or at least be given heat and hot water during the cold of a New York City winter. So for more on the inhumane conditions there and the struggle to support those who are imprisoned inside, we spoke to South Brooklyn DSA member and organizer Amy Koshbin. And let's go ahead and roll that clip.
My name is Amy Koshbin. I am a member of Sunset Park Popular Assembly. I'm also a member of the South Brooklyn DSA branch. A year ago, around wintertime, Metropolitan Detention Center, which is the federal prison located in Sunset Park, started to have power outages to the point where inmates didn't have heat, didn't have hot water, didn't have lights in their cells, and it ended up taking nonstop protesting so that electeds started coming out and demanding that the conditions be remedied. And so just this past week, suddenly, it's getting cold and we're seeing parts of the prison not getting heat and hot water again. We've been putting pressure by showing up every Friday at 5:30 p.m. to show that we are watching what's going on in the jail, that there is a group of concerned neighbors and concerned people in the city that are actually paying attention to the fact that this is happening and continues to happen. On top of that, Jamel Floyd was a 35-year-old Black man who was murdered in his cell at MDC like a week after George Floyd was murdered. October 13th was the day he would have been released, which was 120 days after he died. The case has kind of languished. Jamel Floyd's family still doesn't have the medical records. The people at MDC are not releasing those records to his lawyer, though it's been demanded now since June, and we're in November. And so Jamel Floyd's family is still going out to the prison, to MDC every Friday, and they're still demanding justice for Jamel.
Yeah, you killed my son in there, and I'm always voice my opinion. I'm never gonna bite my tongue for nobody. If I have to die biting my tongue, I'll just die. I am Jamel Floyd's father, and I'll die to go to hell to save his soul. No justice for Jamel Floyd. Say his name. Jamel Floyd. I am his father, and I will always speak my mind. I will never bite my tongue under no circumstance. I'm not afraid. I have no respect at all for none of you correctional officers. But what you did to my son was unjustified. No justification for what y'all did to my son. The court's gonna hold this here together.
Carolyn Richardson. Carolyn Richardson. I want you to know I'm out here for you. Carolyn Richardson is a female prisoner over there. She's there for 4 years so far. Since she's been there, due to negligence by medical, she's gone blind. She's been a victim of sexual assault, and I want them to free her now. 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 Free her now.
I got a message for everybody from Jailhouse Lawyer Speaks. On December 12th, which is a Saturday, at 12 p.m. to 2 p.m., we're going to be marching to Gracie Mansion. So we're going to uplift the call that people incarcerated matter too, that people incarcerated should have human rights. And lastly, what I want to say, I want to read a quote from a known political prisoner by the name of George Jackson. He said, "Settle your quarrels, come together, understand the reality of our situation, understand that fascism is already here, that people are already dying who could be saved, that generations more will live poor, butchered lives, half lives, if you fail to act. Do what must be done, discover your humanity and your love and revolution." Thank you.
My name is Natasha White. I'm an advocate and a formerly incarcerated woman who has spent from the age of 13 to the age of 40 in and out of prison. I want to tell you that if we don't fight for us, nobody will. We are all entitled to be treated like human beings. We are all entitled to be handled with care. We are all entitled to heat and hot water. We are all entitled to justice. We are all entitled to freedom. The death of this young man, Jamel, is horrendous. He is not the first, and he will not be the last. The rape and negligence of Carolyn Richardson is a shame. We need to do everything in our power to fight for their freedom, because by the grace of God, they're going to die. Any day it can be you. Any day it could be her. Any day it could be your child. Get off your ass and tear it up. Free them all! Free them all! Free them all! Free them all! Free them all!
And so Jamel Floyd's family, along with Sunset Park Popular Assembly, are trying to organize a large rally on December 4th for people to come out and to kind of make another big push to demand justice for Jamel Floyd, to have his medical records released, and to put a lot of eyes and attention. So December 4th, 5:30. Show up at MDC, which is at 29th Street and 3rd Avenue in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. Show up with noisemakers, show up with instruments. If you want to get involved in organizing, reach out to the Sunset Assembly Instagram. That's probably the easiest, and it's just at Sunset Assembly. We want to make this a big spectacle and press-worthy as well, so that people really come out and put their eyes back on these issues.
So that was Amy from South Brooklyn, DSA, and Sunset Park Popular Assembly on the fight for justice for Jamel Floyd and all those who are incarcerated at Metropolitan Detention Center in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. So please follow them and keep up with that struggle. We are here on Revolutions Per Minute with members of our Religion and Socialism Working Group, and it is the night before Thanksgiving. So folks, I'd love to hear from your experience, your studies, or your work, your best recommendations for how to speak to your family about religion and politics and how to have respectful conversations across differences. Danielle, would you like to start us off?
Sure. I think we must. I think when we speak with our family, it's religion, depending on where they're coming from, and every individual. First thing I think we should consider is the person's belief, and I always believe you shouldn't push your own beliefs, but rather open the door to having a conversation. And I think just starting a conversation, especially in these times when we find human-to-human contact to be a little bit more difficult, I think it's important for us to keep engaging with each other. And in that realm, we tend to see in most of the times we tend to find things that are in common and that connect us. And another thing I would say is, like, if you see right now in the left, you see a lot of, like, people tend to hold back the fact that they're religious or the word morality, and then on the right you see it being hijacked. You see conservatives hijacking it for their own, to justify things that are immoral, right? Like locking up kids in the cages, and no matter how much wealth you have, it's okay. While kids are starving, while we're, all of us take subways, you get on the stops in certain neighborhoods, and you see going into the city that people are human beings that are laying in the street, but then we're desensitized to feeling. And I think that empathy is missing, and they're hijacking religion to justify and desensitize people. And I think we must have more conversation about the role of morality and the role of religion, the role of beliefs in socialism, because a lot of our beliefs have that in common. Like, I think we have, if no matter what the religious background, there are certain issues that I think most of the issues we would come to agreement with that are important. Like, like I mentioned, kids in cages, or if you look at our immigration policy, and then in the way our capitalism society works, we are in Wall Street, trillions of dollars are being traded, right, like that. But yet poor people who have only labor to trade are not able to cross borders. So there are issues that we must take up that cause and say, like, it's important to talk about the poor people. And that's part of the reason the Poor People's Campaign, and you see the work Reverend William Barber the second is doing. I think it's important for religious socialists to engage with our communities in a concrete way.
So I don't have much advice other than practice deep listening. I think it's important to realize religion as well as politics are not monolithic. It's important to probe the person with open questions rather than closed ones, to really understand where they're coming from, why they hold on to certain beliefs, and practice certain things. It's like soapbox preachers you see on the street. They're not very convincing, right? So we can't just yell and shout political indoctrination at them and expect them to get woke and start, fighting the good fight.
I think with family, the main goal, particularly if they come from more conservative backgrounds, is just to get them curious. You always want to move people like one degree over. I think any basic organizing, training, or even if you come from an evangelical background, you might also have some training in this. And so, you could start with talking about shared values, shared commitments, look for the overlaps, I agree with you that scripture is important. I agree with you that, this is important. I just think this is a way to get there. And have you heard about this? Have you heard about, cite certain people encyclical or certain early church father or this thing in Acts or this church doing this cool thing? What do you think about that? I think in particular, churches are pretty good at, in sermons level, kind of pointing out and critiquing the symptoms of capitalism. So they'll talk about, we're also overworked and stressed, or, we just value productivity and efficiency more than like love and like empathy. And they'll try to address these problems on a psychological level. And so you just need to have faith in God, or we need to practice love of our neighbor more. And I think that's great. But I think where you can come in is kind of connect the dots and say like, so let's think about why it is that we're overworked, why it is that we value productivity and efficiency more, why it is that advertisements really affect our body image, like what is the incentive of these consumer product companies? It's not accidental. It's not just like this is always the way things have been. And so kind of connecting the dots and pointing out a basic political, framework for explaining how things are, I think can go a long way. And I always like to say that I don't think Christianity dictates socialism is the correct answer. I think it's a plausible read from it, and just having a little bit of humility in the conversation as well can, go a long way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you make a great point, Sarah, that there is a lot of crossover between some types of organizing conversations and some types of evangelical approaches, even down to giving out literature or palm cards, right? That's a tactic that's used by many people for many different reasons. So here on Revolutions Per Minute, we are coming to the end of our show. This one flew by with these three wonderful guests, but we will go ahead and open the phones one more time for comments or questions about religion and socialism. The number here, 212-209-2877. Once again, that's 212-209-2877.
All right, is that caller still hanging on?
Yeah.
Oh, hello. You're live with Revolutions Per Minute. Thank you for calling. What is your comment or question?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Let's see. My name is Nyc. I was thinking about some things, but I was waiting so long I stopped remembering. Oh, okay. I was saying about deep listening was interesting. One question was, do you think that historically in the last 200, maybe 300 years, but not, can you acknowledge that religion or certain religious ideas have been used as a obstacle to social progress and socialist class struggle, actual concrete, like that, if you would acknowledge that.
Yeah, I think I understand your question.
While at the same time recognizing the importance of the moral, coincidental, moral commonalities of socialism and various religions. My personal experience is mostly with Christianity, but also Judaism and Muslims, like the ideas of brotherhood, kindness, compassion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But even also, I'd like to add that even sometimes that liberal version can also be an obstacle, but that's another question. But that being said, I've come to notice in real life, as a frustrated revolutionary for over 40 years, that sometimes when I see who's really doing something to help the poor and the suffering, regardless of their revolutionary newspaper or headline or label, it's often certain religious people with certain convictions. And I'm attracted to that, and I'm interested in that, even though I'm kind of an agnostic socialist, And also, like historically, if you look at people like John Brown, and it doesn't always have to be this pacifistic Martin Luther King, Gandhi thing, which is good in a certain context. But your Malcolm X at some point was expounding the idea of self-defense as opposed to total pacifism, whereas people would call him a dangerous, violent person, even though he wasn't really saying that. I think this is the key. I noticed somebody mention morality, and it's because the right wing has used the word morality. Even before they started using it in the 80s, it was called the moral majority. It is not new, but
Absolutely.
even before the moral majority. So the point I'm getting at is, everything is in context. Everything depends on the circumstances and how we interpret this stuff. That being said,
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your comments. You've said a lot, and I'm sorry I have to cut you off so that we can move on for the rest of our show. But thank you so much for calling. And I think Sarah had a direct response to some of what you said.
Thank you so much for your comment. I think I probably should have started with that. It's a bit amiss to kind of jump straight into how Christianity and socialism are compatible without first sort of doing the Christian work of repentance, so to speak, about ways in which Christianity has definitely been on the side of the oppressor. I think particularly within America, there is a shift when ministers used to be pretty working class, and they used to be talking about laborers and working class people used to see the ministers as one of them. And then as the Gilded Age starts to rise and ministers start becoming well paid, they start taking the side of capital over laborers, in which then that Heath Carter is a professor at Princeton Seminary, writes on labor unions. Your point, I think I just want to highlight though about how sometimes, when I talk to my fellow Christian leftist friends, we talk about church as a political project. And the truth is sometimes do you need everyone to be well versed in socialist theory and history in order to do radical socialist things? And I think church is a good example of ways in which you can maybe organize people to do acts of mutual aid, lobby on release of prisoners, what have you, without necessarily having to do a lot of theoretical education, because you can use Christian language and values and stories as an intermediary. So maybe I'll use the word grace as opposed to talking about, some other kind of political framework, and I might get to the same outcome at the end of the day. But one might be a little bit easier because it's already in that person's language and vocabulary.
Wonderful point. So we're nearing the end of our hour for Revolutions Per Minute, and I'm wondering if any of you, maybe Guillaume or Daniel, have any final parting thoughts that you'd like to leave our listening audience with, whether that be on something that we've spoken about already during the show, or something that you just want to make sure people hear about on this topic.
Yeah, I would just like to add, as far as the idea of giving, I know in the Islamic tradition we have something called zakat, which is one of the pillars that you are required to give. I think those sort of, and even outside, we have to have practices of empathizing with those who don't have, and I think that's something that we can find a way to do, because again, the right is using that, right? The right is hijacking morality. I mean, if you look at Paula White, who's the spiritual advisor to the president, I mean, what they use is, well, greed is good. Their argument, their morality that's their definition. That their morality, it's okay, it's good, as long as you look out for number one, that is right. I mean, that's just hijacking it, right? So So I think we have to, in the left, maybe collaborate with each other to come and because we have a lot more things that we can fall back on. Like, I mean, there's so across the scriptures. I think they're filled with idea of charity, idea of looking after your neighbor. So I think we must reclaim that, and I think we have to collectively play a part in tackling that issue.
So I wanted to go back to Buddhist socialism because I just gave you a lot of names and not a lot of thought behind it. So Buddhist socialists like Manhei go back to the Four Noble Truths that the historical Buddha Shakyamuni spoke about, and how the central problem for humanity and all sentient life is this idea of attachment or desire. So he really accounts for this idea of material accumulation, or this mode of hoarding that we see championed and even praised in capitalism to be one of the fundamental existential problems of humanity, as well as all of existence. And one of the ways in which Buddhists can engage with the path towards liberation is not just self-transformation towards getting rid of one's attachments, but also engaging in the material struggles, using skillful means as they use in the Buddhist tradition, embodying the Bodhisattva's idea of compassion to bring people towards liberation rather than keeping them in a state of ignorance or delusion.
Thank you. And thank you all so much for being here and contributing your knowledge on these very interesting subjects. You know, I feel like we scratched the surface of so many huge questions tonight that we could do a whole series on religion and socialism here on Revolutions Per Minute, or our Revolutions Per Minute listeners who are interested in this topic can check out our New York City DSA Religion and Socialism Working Group. Just as always, we'll have information about how to follow them and check out their work and upcoming meetings and events in our show notes. And Danielle, Sarah, and Girim, thank you so much for being here tonight. And to all our listening audience, thank you so much for tuning in. We will be back next Wednesday at 9 p.m. for more from our work to build a socialist world. This has been Revolutions Per Minute. I'm Amy Wilson, and we'll see you soon.